Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of Better Call Paul, a video series where I, Thijs, give my colleague Paul a call and ask him very specific Varnish-related questions. In this episode, we'll be focusing on the brand new Varnish Enterprise release, which is Varnish 6012R5, that is dedicated to a new way of dealing with TLS certificates in Varnish. So let's see if Paul is available, give him a call, and let him give his opinion on this brand new release and these brand new capabilities. Paul, it's December and it's the last time this year I wanted to ask you a question. So, Better Call Paul, episode 4, if I'm not mistaken. And I want to ask you about that new Varnish Enterprise 6012R5 release, specifically the TLS stuff. Is there anything you could tell us?
Yes, we made this release explicitly only for the TLS features, so that we can bring these features separately and people can downgrade if something goes wrong. But so far, nothing has gone wrong and the release is solid. And
let's unveil that mystery. What is the new stuff? What are we talking about?
The new stuff is all about being able to manage your TLS certificates in a different way than was possible before. Previously, you had the configuration file and you loaded the configuration file when Varnish was started, and then that was it. If you changed the configuration in TLS, then you needed to restart Varnish, and we wanted to go away from that and instead have a dynamic way of changing the certificates without having to restart Varnish.
So if we take a little bit of a history lesson in terms of TLS and Varnish, of course, as the saying goes, in the beginning there was nothing. Then eventually we started facilitating TLS termination and decided to build our own TLS proxy. It's still out there, it's still open source, still very good. It's called Hitch. And that configuration syntax that you refer to, that's the Hitch syntax, right, Paul?
Yes, and part of the point here is that HTTPS is just HTTP with a layer of TLS security. S doesn't mean secure, but it is part of having a secure internet site, and everyone expects it. And from having Hitch as the TLS terminator to do all of the TLS work, we changed some years back to have in-core TLS, which is a native TLS implementation inside of Varnish D where Hitch is not necessary. And when we configured that, you used an Hitch configuration file, because that's what we used to embrace and recommend to everyone, and which we also made.
I remember that era where this change wasn't done because we didn't believe in Hitch anymore. We did it because of performance reasons, because we could go to, what was the thinking then, was that 200 gigs a second? Was it that era?
Yeah, it was around that time. So we found that we could do with Hitch and Unix domain sockets around 150. But when we had in-core TLS, we were able to go beyond 180. And this was at the time when 100 gigabit was almost unheard of in servers. So that's when we did this, and it was needed.
The good old days, because now we're at a 1.2, 1.3 terabits per second, and moving forward. So yeah, those are, I wouldn't call them Mickey Mouse numbers, but we've gone way beyond that. But what I found interesting about that native TLS implementation is staying compatible in a big way for people who used Hitch. So that configuration syntax we had, it's still compatible, right? Nothing changes with the new release, but it only takes a subset. Can you educate our users here?
When you are configuring TLS, there are several things you need to choose. And the certificates is one part of that. You also have to specify which kind of ciphers that you want, what kind of protocols you advertise during Alpen, and similar things. And these things you can put in this Hitch configuration files, but the certificates is kind of special because they change over time. You need to renew them. And you might want to change the other configuration bits. That's interesting, but it's not very common. But if you have lots of sites every 3 months or every 6 months or every 12 months, you need to update the certificates, and you don't want to restart Varnish.
Now I understand the significance of that, because you've just said it again at the end. Without an actual restart, none of this is happening. It won't read that configuration file again.
Yes, now before.
Yeah, before, but that release, if I look at our docs page right now, and I'll share the visual with the people watching this, this was released on the 7th of December. That's very recent. So it offers a new avenue or new different avenues of dealing with TLS, where in the past you needed that uppercase -A and then the reference to the TLS configuration file. Now you can use your typical -A runtime parameters to specify a listening port that has HTTPS support.
Yeah, it's more in harmony with the old proxy notation, where you accepted connections using the proxy protocol. It's
So that
quite a
means we have three
mouthful.
keywords now. Plain HTTP, HTTPS as the new one, and proxy is probably still there if you want a proxy. So it's a new
Yeah,
keyword that's been added to -A.
you can say that, but we want to get rid of proxy as a technology simply because it is slightly less performant than what we have now.
Absolutely. So enlighten us on what the capabilities are and how people would go about managing certificates dynamically using that new feature.
So typically, you have a configuration file with a list of these certificates. They are usually called PEM files, and when you start up, you have all of the settings that you have from the old Hitch configuration files, and then suddenly you realize that the certificate is running out. Maybe it is going to expire in less than a month, and you have bought this new or created a new certificate, and you want to have Varnish present that when a client is coming to connect to Varnish. And then what you do is that you put the file in the right location on your file system, and then you tell Varnish about this file and tells it that is what you are going to use when I tell you. And you can do that with several certificates that you renew at the same time. And when you have informed Varnish about all of the things that should change, then you commit these changes. And then that's an atomic operation. Then all of the old certificates that were in use and that you have replaced with new certificates, they will not any longer be presented to the client, but you will get the new certificates. And this is very complicated. I mean, it is not that complicated normally, but you have these things called wildcard certificates, and you have some rules. For example, you're not allowed to have two certificates that can be presented for the same host name. And if you need to change anything with wildcard certificate, it's necessary to give Varnish all of the changes it needs to do to get into the new state, and then commit them all at the same time.
So that gives a certain level of flexibility to the end user. I think we're also serving our own agenda because Varnish Enterprise is more than just a cache. We also have the control plane to manage it all. So now we've provided our part of our development team who builds the UI and the controller system behind it a way to offer a graphical user interface to manage certificates on a cluster of Varnish servers. So that's probably quite exciting.
Also, an API for it.
Yes, definitely.
So when you have a new certificate and you want to deploy that certificate on many servers, then having a single endpoint of doing that, if it is a user interface or a CLI or API endpoint, doesn't matter. But the main point is that you do the change to the certificate list that you have, and then the controller makes sure that it's being committed to all of your service and checks that it's working.
And that change will be part of the latest major release in the Varnish controller. I haven't looked at the timelines yet, but do you know when that thing is being released?
It is Q1 2024. I think it's
to
either,
those of you who use Varnish controller, look for those announcements because that will make your life a lot easier. I'm sure of that.
I'm not allowed to promise anything, but I think it's going to be January or February and not March.
Very nice.
We'll see.
While we were chatting before we pressed record, there was another feature in the pipeline specifically at the Varnish TLS management level. Anything you can mention about that?
Yes. So if you have a very simple setup where you just have a certificate or some certificates and you just want to get to the latest version of the files that you changed on disk, then a reload command for the TLS part of Varnish is going to be introduced soon. And that is going to be what sysadmins without the controller will use, probably, for simplicity.
Let's leave it at that, Paul. Thanks again for taking the time. Thanks again for taking my call. And to our audience, thanks again for checking us out. I hope you enjoyed this one. And it's pretty exciting what we have in Varnish 6.0.12 Managing TLS certificates in such a dynamic way without the need to restart Varnish is wonderful. And as we mentioned, Q1 2024, we'll be having the new Varnish controller version 6 that will leverage these TLS certificate loading features to allow cluster-wide management of the certificates in the API, the CLI, and the graphical user interface of the Varnish controller. Good times ahead. Thanks again for watching this episode. We'll be back next month with yet another Better Call Paul.